Hi everyone, I'm Mystical Pigeon, and I'm making a video game about physics-based flight. I've wanted to fly ever since I was a kid, and I've really enjoyed playing games that let me live out this fantasy. There are two big influences here: Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Outside of the platforming, my favorite thing to do in Mario 64 was to load into Bob-omb Battlefield, grab the wing cap, and fly around. It was so much fun to zip up and down and really play with the momentum. In order to fly high, you'd have to dive down to gain that momentum, then pull back to get a burst of speed. It was so much fun. Until the cap wears off. Skyward Sword tried a similar thing. In the sky, if you want to move fast horizontally, you have to flap and climb, then dive down to pick up speed. But there's barely any obstacles to avoid or really anything to do while flying. You're really just pointing in direction and going. I'm definitely not the first person to make a game about flight, and I won't be the last, but I think my take on it is novel. I've restarted it multiple times as I was learning Unity and game development in general. Originally, it was really ugly and hard to control. Each iteration's gotten better. For a while you were a dragon. I think this latest version is where things are going to stay going forward, because I'm finally happy with how the physics feel. What I'm aiming for is something that feels real without being 100% realistic. I want the player to feel the freedom of flight and the restrictions that entails, without getting frustrated. The player's flight is dictated by 4 forces: gravity, lift, drag, and flapping. You don't get to stay in the air for free. Gravity works just like you'd expect. A force pulls down on the player, trying to move them towards ground at all times. Flapping is also pretty intuitive. As long as you have stamina, when you push the flap button, you'll give yourself a boost upward and forward. This is very useful for getting off the ground and for gaining speed. While you're flapping, the player's control of lift is greatly reduced. Lift gets complicated. Over the years that I've worked on this, I've read a lot about how lift actually works. To boil it down to its simplest form, moving an object through the air creates a force that pushes perpendicular to that movement. You can influence this force in various ways, but the main ones are the angle of attack, how the object is angled relative to its movement, and the speed. So a flat angle of attack will produce little or no lift, regardless of the speed. Adjust that angle up, and you'll start to gain lift relative to your speed, and adjust it down, you'll get negative lift. For each wing, I calculate a lift coefficient based on its angle of attack by comparing the rotation of the bird and the direction of its velocity. The player can then adjust this angle of attack through an input. Pulling back on a control stick will increase the angle of attack above its measured value, and pushing it forward will decrease it. Once I have this lift coefficient, I plug it into the general lift equation and apply the resulting force at a point along the bird's wing. If both wings produce the same lift, the same force is applied on both sides of the bird, causing it to pitch up or down. If one wing produces more lift than the other, and the forces are uneven, this causes the bird to bank. If the wings produce opposing lift, the bird will do a roll. Another important part of this equation is the wing area. This is another control the player has. You can push a button to fold in your wings. Doing this severely decreases the wing area, producing essentially no lift and reducing drag, which is exactly what you want when you're diving down. Drag comes in 2 flavors: induced drag and parasitic drag. Both are calculated with a similar formula to lift. Induced drag is a direct result of your lift. To get its drag coefficient, I do some funny math with the lift coefficient. Induced drag is applied at the wings, similar to lift. In the real world, parasitic drag is a result of your silhouette. A bigger silhouette will produce more drag. In my game, I calculate this drag a bit differently. I have 3 different ways to play with it. There's a base parasitic drag that is always applied, plus an optional drag based on your height, another one on your angle, and one based on the angle between your forward direction and your velocity. This lets me dial in the behavior exactly how I want it. I can apply less drag when you're pointing downwards and diving, and more when you're pointing upwards and climbing. Or I can apply more drag when you're pointing away from your direction of motion. Once this coefficient is calculated, I again generate the force and apply it. Parasitic drag gets applied at a set position near the bird's tail, and always points opposite the direction of motion. This results in a nice self-correcting effect, which makes the bird tend to point forward. Like I said earlier, I've played with a few different control schemes. In the current version, the player's wings are calculated independently. So originally, I had you using one control stick for each wing. Moving the left stick would change the left wing's angle, moving the right stick would change the right wing's angle. Pulling back on both would result in pitching up, and pushing both forward would result in pitching down. Since the flight model still works this way, I can flip back and forth between that model and the new model. Right now, everything is controlled by a single stick. Push it forward and it makes both wings angle forward. Push it sideways to make one wing angle up and the other down. This is much easier to get to grips with, but you don't have quite as tight control over the flight as you do with the two-stick version. I'm thinking this will be a setting that you can switch between, so that if you want to use the more advanced flight controls, you'll be able to do so. As much as I want to give the player full freedom, I don't want you to be able to flap forever and ignore the lift and drag interplay. To this end, I've added a stamina system. When you flap, you lose stamina until it's depleted. Once it's gone, the flap force gets scaled down to 0, but the other implications of flapping, the decreased lift control, still apply while you try to flap. Stamina can be regained in a few ways. You'll naturally get some back over time, but very slowly. You gain it back almost instantly by landing. The best way to regain stamina is to dive or to bank and roll. The rate that you regain stamina increases based on your speed, your forward angle, and your rotational velocity. If you're flying forward or upward, you won't regain much at all. If you dive, you'll regain stamina very quickly, especially if it's a fast dive. But you'll also regain a lot by doing fancy banks and rolls left and right. Many birds can flap to hover in place. In some of my original prototypes, I gave the player full control over the angle of the flap force. You could flap forward, backward, or side to side, but this never really felt good to control. So instead, you have a hover button. When you push it, it acts as a brake. You'll slow down to a stop and hover in place. Then you can spin yourself left and right to get a better sense of your location. Right now this doesn't cost any stamina, even though you are technically flapping. I might change this in the future. While flying, if you get close enough to the ground and you're going slow enough and angled just right, you can land. Come in too fast and you'll bounce off the ground. Come in at a bad angle and you'll crash. When you land, I switch control to an entirely different ground system. This involves two main checks. First, to get information about the ground that you're standing on, and the second to get information about the ground that you're trying to move to. From these two checks, I move the player along the ground smoothly and with a speed set by the ground angle, so if you're going up a sharper incline, you'll move slower. This makes the movement feel nice, while still giving me full control over your speed on these inclines. Let me know if you want me to go into this system in more depth in a future video. I also plan to go over how the water works with buoyancy, how my world gets generated, and how my sky, clouds, and water are all rendered. Let me know in the comments if there's anything in particular you want to know more about. I'm always looking for feedback on this project, and I'm not really sure where it's going to go. Right now it's more of a toy than a game, but I'm having a lot of fun working on it. Please like and subscribe if you want to follow my progress. Thanks for watching.